So integrated assessment modeling, we define as doing integration of different disciplines using models to support policies, especially climate policy. And in the last week, we had the major conference of parties as part of the UNFCCC. And in that context, it might be really good to see and to consider whether that conference or the climate policy progress in the last year has implications for the type of research that our community needs to do. And to inform us about that, we invited a panel of 4 speakers to give us their thoughts on what is happening in international climate policy right now and what implications it would have for the type of research that would be need to come from integrated assessment modeling. And the 4 speakers are people that might be using integrated assessment modeling work or have been working with our community. And I think that provides a really nice connection for this topic. So as the first speaker, I would like to invite Alan FAWCETT, who is the chief of the climate economics branch of US EPA, to give his thoughts on this topic.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I'm very honored to talk about the implications of GLASGOW for IEMC research with this wonderful community. I think the really interesting thing about GLASGOW is this is the first test of the ratchet mechanism in Paris. And the structure of the Paris Agreement really is countries come together and develop their own plans of what they're going to do, their pledges, their NDCs or long-term strategies, guided by the overarching goals of the Paris Agreement, the Article 2 goals to achieve well below 2 degrees, approaching 1.5, the Article 4 goal, achieving a balance between sources and sinks in the second half of the century, also informed by the paths they are seeing for themselves, laying out their long-term strategies. And each 5 years we come back and focus the world's full attention on climate change to ratchet that ambition. And a lot of the work of this community is shining a light on that pathway, helping to see are the pledges that countries are doing enough? Are they delivering upon the goals of the Paris Agreement? And are the actions the countries are taking delivering upon those pledges? To talk a little bit about a couple papers here, knowing that showing actual figures is a death sentence for a short talk, so I won't talk about these too much. But 6 years ago, we looked at the NDC submitted into the Paris Agreement and saw that before Paris, we were on a pathway that looked at a fairly significant chance of severe climate change, greater than 3, even greater than 4 degrees C of warming. And the NDCs, really, dramatically limited that chance of severe climate change, but still left us, quite a ways away from, it's on a path to 2 degrees, or certainly a path well below 2 degrees. Fast forward 6 years, and ambition has been significantly ratcheted. We look at the current, the continued ambition scenario based on updated pledges. Out of GLASGOW, we see that that chance of severe warming has been, even more dramatically limited. Almost getting rid of the chance of greater than 4 degrees, and less than 10% chance of a warming greater than 3 degrees under these pledges. And we give us a real shot at 2 degrees, a 1 in 3 chance at 2 degrees with these continued ambitions under the updated pledges. Clearly, more ambition is needed. We're not yet at a well below 2 degree scenario based on these pledges. We need to ratchet that ambition more, but also we need to deliver upon those pledges. We need to, if we look at the continued, the current policy scenario here, we're still a ways away from actually delivering on the pledges countries have made. So, there are 2 aspects to think about here for the IEMC communities. How are we increasing ambition, and how are we delivering upon that ambition? Looking at the increasing ambition, there are multiple ways that parties are doing that. They're updating their NDCs, increasing the ambition of their current NDC, or submitting a new NDC for 5 years further out, or they're looking at their long-term strategies, increasing the ambition of those long-term strategies, moving up the net zero yield, but also increasing the scope of their coverage, bringing in non-CO2s into the fold if they hadn't had those in there before. We see the global methane pledge as an important move at that point, or further action with Kigali to reduce F gases. But the other aspect of this, putting words into action and delivering upon the pledges parties have made. And this is where I think there's a lot more work to do. We need to move beyond just looking at the policies that are easy to model and start considering some of the political economy constraints around the policy environment of what are the policies countries are actually adopting and putting into place, and what are the constraints policymakers are facing as they try to adopt policies that will deliver upon these pledges. So some of these things, if you look at the US example, we've moved far away from the era of the Waxman-Markey and cap and trade style bills. You look at Build Back Better. This is almost exclusively carrots. There are very few sticks left in the policy. And there are reasons for that within the political economy constraints that people are facing. Policymakers are concerned about all sorts of things, distributional impacts, environmental justice, air quality, jobs as a perennial concern. But there are also features of the policy landscape that are important to consider. If we look at just a price-based policy, you can see examples if it's implemented in one way that higher electricity prices could be impeding the push to electrify end uses. Whereas a more carrots-based approach may be able to push renewables and decarbonize the power sector while simultaneously keeping prices down to electrify end uses. But also I think we need to think about how ambition spreads, how credibility spreads, and how leadership works within the policy space. Governments don't often lead on this. It's not necessarily a political will where they are putting a policy in place and making everything happen, but they're following the lead of civil society, of firms, of seeing what the technology landscape is. As prices come down for technologies like batteries and wind and solar, it makes it far easier for governments to adopt policies. And it makes it easier for firms to adopt goals. So seeing automakers saying they're going to electrify their fleets, that makes it easier for governments to come in and put in policies in place that solidify that pathway. And that happens within the country as we look at the technology landscape leading to more ambitious policy, and between countries as countries lead by example and make it easier for other countries to follow. So that interaction between previous policies that create that technology landscape and future policies that enable this pathway towards net zero is an important dynamic to explore. And I'm running out of time here, so I'll just close up by saying I'm really heartened by what I've seen this week. The whole world, we're all finding our way out of the climate crisis and along the path to net zero. And for policymakers, IEMs are just an incredibly important tool that really helps shine a light on that path and helping us find our way. And as a community, we need to just make sure we're not just looking under the proverbial lamppost, but looking ahead and shining that light from the IEMs where we think will be most needed. And I'm incredibly heartened by the wonderful and thoughtful research that I've seen all week from this community. It's wonderful to see. Keep it up.
Thank you, Alan, both for the kind words, but also for the suggestions for research. I would like to ask the second speaker, Niklas HÖHNE, from the Climate Institute, to take the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also from my side, thanks for the invitation. And it's also an honor to be here at this integrated assessment modeling community. And I fully agree with Alan. This is absolutely fundamental for the policy making. So that's why I think it's very nice to be here and say a little bit about the COP26. I'm not integrated assessment modeler. We are using them a lot, and they're super useful. So we couldn't think without them. I have two thoughts here. One is, well, if we are thinking about the COP, we first need to think of what the COP is, and it's many things. And I think in this year, you could really see it that it's two things. One, the things that are officially on the agenda, And you all know what happened at the last day, this cover decision that they are asking for new national targets, new NDCs already by 2022. There's been these decisions on carbon markets, some implementation rules on the stock take and transparency. But there's also been a lot around that is not officially on the agenda, but which is equally important. So updates of NDCs, we heard it already, many new countries put forward NDCs, long-term strategies, and net zero targets. We almost have all countries with net zero targets now. We have these initiatives that Ellen already mentioned, methane initiative, coal phase-out initiatives, clean transport initiatives, and we have financial contributions by country. So a lot is happening there, and I think that all has implications also on what the insights that process needs. And for me, I want to offer two thoughts for the integrated assessment community. One is be fast. And that is because if you look at this, there are certain things that happen and that will go even faster. Yeah, we thought we have NDCs only every 5 years. Now we'll have NDCs hopefully every year, because we are so late in the game that things need to change fast. We have all of a sudden all of these net zero targets. We have these initiatives, the single theme initiatives that come forward with new ideas, new targets, new participants. All of that is very quick, and if the integrated assessment modeling community wants to provide an input to this, then it has to be fast. Just to give you an order of magnitude of what has changed over the last year in terms of the NDCs, this is from our project, the Climate Action Tracker, that we do together with Climate Analytics. You see global greenhouse gas emissions here from 1990 rising with the COVID dip in light blue. And then you see that greenhouse gas emissions are at basically the same level in 2030 with all of the pledges, while they should be cut in half with the green band here until 2030 if we want to be in line with the 1.5 goal. And you can see here the first large green arrow, and somehow my mouse doesn't work, but anyway, there it is. So this first large arrow was the gap that we have had before Glasgow. Then countries submitted new climate pledges, that's this green part here, and that moved the level down. But now we still have a large gap after Glasgow. And that basically means that if we are really serious about getting there, we need to be very quick until 2030 to do something about it. And that's why countries agreed to submit more pledges. But it was not only pledges. This is only from the national targets. But we also had sectoral initiatives. So this is the same arrow that you saw before, the going down a few gigatons from national pledges, 4 maybe. Then we had sectoral initiatives. We did a simple assessment here of what that could be, but okay, that's the order of magnitude, you have it. And you had a decision on market mechanisms, which could go both ways, either more or less. My main point here is the important part to be relevant here is to be able to look at all of these things and to provide insights to the political process. And for example, in the UNEP emissions gap report, which does the same thing, putting all these things together, we basically, at one point, it was not possible to take all the peer-reviewed and integrated assessment literature because it was simply too old. It didn't have the COVID dip in, it didn't have the latest NDCs in, and they couldn't be used. And that's unfortunate. There's so much good work there, and if it's coming too late, it doesn't work. Another one, recommendation for me would be linked more with the bottom-up studies to be faster in your integrated assessment modeling. And my second point is think zero, because, well, we want to go to zero, and that requires a little bit of a different thinking. We are not thinking on the margin anymore. We want to go a complete way. And I'm pretty sure during the last few days, you've talked about this as well. This idea of exponential change, that if you have a new zero carbon technology, we are really talking about zero carbon technologies now, which we have to put into the system. At the beginning, you are putting a lot of effort into the system, but the technology doesn't really take off. In some cases, you can't even measure it because it's so small. Something may be happening, but you don't even know. And then and also nothing happens in greenhouse gas emissions. They are not going down, but there may be a lot happening here in this first phase. And then hopefully you reach this transformation or tipping point, and then it goes exponential. The issue is probably most of the models have something like this in them, some exponential change, learning curves and things like that, but they do not yet cover whether there are any efforts to initiate that transition. Yeah, so for example, zero emission steel, whether there's a lot of effort right now to increase the uptake or even test zero emission steel, that if it would be there, well, we don't even know, we need to measure whether it's happening. And then if we know it, it should be integrated into the tools. And that's actually why we, in one discussion paper, mentioned that you could do something like a transformation seismograph. You could check whether something is happening on the level of zero emission technologies. You would measure many different indicators and you would be trying to see, is something really happening? And if you see that something in a transition is happening by measuring all of these indicators, you know that at least something is coming up, and then you can also integrate it into integrated assessment models. That's kind of the idea. And if you're more interested, look into the papers, because my time's up. So the second point is that transformation can be exponential. You all know that. Would be very nice to detect it somehow and include it in integrated assessment models. And you all know, and I think the integrated assessment models are all well beyond just having a carbon price. You need other policy tools in models and in real life to initiate that. Those were my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Niklas. Yeah, so we already heard in the two speeches, at least some things in common, including the focus on real world policies, for instance, taking into account the local context. And then Niklas was emphasizing to be up to date and fast and think zero. At this point, I would like to give the floor to Jim SKEA, the co-chair of Working Group 3.
Yeah, okay, thanks Detlef, and thanks for the invitation to talk to you. And I have to say it's a very relaxing way of spending a Friday afternoon compared with getting the final draft of the Working Group 3 report ready to go to governments, which we did last Monday. And I'm so relaxed I don't have any slides either, so I'll just go to talk and I'll make 3 points. One is to talk about the Glasgow Pact and the implications for the community. Then I want to talk about some of the landing zones within the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement for where the work of the community might go. And finally, I just want to say a few things, just to put up a little flag about long-term scenarios development and issues within IPCC around that. So first of all, on the Glasgow Pact itself, the whole first section is on science and urgency. So, integrated assessment modelling and other forms of science are in there. That part of the report, it welcomes the Working Group 1 report. It expresses alarm and utmost concern, quote unquote, about the findings of the Working Group 1 report. And it also looks ahead to the Working Group 2 and 3 reports and, basically invites IPCC to present them to the next intersessional in Bonn in June. Now, one thing I wanted to flag about this is, many of the people on this, I guess, are involved in the mitigation side of it. But it was very clear from the Glasgow Pact that the importance of adaptation as part of the picture. And so, Working Group 3 person talking about this. They specifically want the Working Group 2 report presented to COP27 in Egypt at the end of next year. And there are it calls upon the research community to further understanding of impacts of climate change, response options and adaptation needs. And I noticed Brian and Neil is actually on the call at the moment. And so I think we're very interested that it's not just the mitigation side of scenarios, the adaptation and impact side needs addressed as well. I think in terms of the mitigation part of the pact, the key message is that from the point of view of the COP26 presidency, 1.5 is still alive, quote unquote. I have to say, I think it's probably in the intensive care unit under political life support, but it is technically still alive, which means that by the end of this year, when governments are supposed to be reconsidering and putting in strengthened 2030 targets, the work of the integrated assessment modelling community will still be extremely relevant in providing benchmarks against which the progress can be measured. I should say there's another big section in there on finance, technology transfer and capacity building. Worthwhile saying that I think the big knowledge gaps there are actually on the financing side rather than the investment needs side. You're really quite clear messages there, and also how to get the sums of money that are evidently available to actually flow where they're needed, some of the bigger challenges there. Now, the second point about the landing zones for integrated assessment modelling work, I think there's two things going on. One is the so-called second periodic review of progress towards the ultimate objective of the convention. That's a process that's well underway. And then the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. So in terms of that second periodic review, it's underway. It's running on two themes. And the first theme is extremely relevant. It's about enhancing parties' understanding of the long-term global goal and scenarios towards achieving it, progress made in relation to addressing knowledge gaps, including scenarios for achieving the long-term global goal. So this process, Working Group 3, IPCC, and the work of the Integrated Assessment Modelling community, I think is incredibly important. And it's already been flagged up, by Niklas, how long it can take for some of the IPCC results to work through. We had to cut off the NDCs at 11th of October this year. So the ongoing work of the community, I think, needs to go directly into some of these processes. The structured expert dialogue associated with that second periodic review is underway. The second session of it took place in Glasgow. All we had was Working Group 1 of IPCC, which could present its results. And after they presented, there was nothing but a sequence of Working Group 3 mitigation-related questions, which nobody could answer because the Working Group 3 report has yet to appear yet. So this is a very clear signal that for this community, there's going to be a big landing zone in Bonn next June when that third session of the Structured Expert Dialogue will take place. On the first global stocktake, for the Paris Agreement, it's in 3 stages: information collection and preparation, technical assessment, and consideration of output, the more political stage. The information collection and preparation was considered in Glasgow, and the technical assessment will take place over the next 3 sessions, where again, the integrated assessment modelling communities, insights are going to be incredibly important. I should say the co-facilitators for that are Harold Winkler from South Africa, who is well acquainted with the IEM community, and Farhan Akhtar from the US, who of course is on the US delegation, is well acquainted with IPCC and integrated assessment modelling kind of efforts. So I think that's going to be a very important landing zone for this community. Now, last thing I wanted to talk about very briefly was longer term scenarios development. And it's worthwhile saying probably that IPCC's interest in it may not be completely identical to that of the integrated assessment modelling community, although I think there are very important overlapping interests there. And IPCC has a sequence of the last few years of expert meetings on scenarios, and all of the working group co-chairs together have got together and are making a proposal to the governments for one more expert meeting before the end of the 6th assessment cycle, to take place after the synthesis report is approved, but before the 7th assessment cycle starts. And the proposal we're making to governments, basically has 2 elements. One is on scenario content and the kind of framework for scenarios, and the other part is actually on institutional arrangements. On the content side of it, I think all of the working group co-chairs feel the need to bring the physical uncertainties about the physical aspects of the climate system more squarely into the overall scenario framing. And it's worthwhile saying that I think the slides that Alan showed, clearly are capturing the kind of things. And I think if you start from the working group 2 impacts end of the spectrum, you are going to be concerned about stress testing systems, about the higher end of the range in terms of physical impacts. And the other thing I think in content is the confusion which we could be sowing about the complexity of the scenario space at the moment, with RCPs, SSPs, We have illustrative scenarios now from Working Group 1. We have illustrative pathways from Working Group 3. We really are, you have a lot of capacity to confuse policymakers. And it was very interesting at the Working Group 1 approval, they just wanted to go low, medium and high to simplify the scenario space. And I think that's kind of a lesson for us all. And lastly, just to say on the institutional arrangements, one of the things I think the co-chairs have been also a bit concerned about is the way that research and the line between research and assessment is getting quite blurred between what the research community does and what the IPCC does in terms of assessment. So we would like to think a little bit about the way that IPCC relates to the integrated assessment modelling community. We'd like to think of the status of the kind of databases like the 1.5 database and the AR6 database, which will be released when the report is approved. And we also want to think about, I think, the agreement that we have had between IAMC, EASA, and the Working Group 3 co-chairs with respect to that database. I should say that quite frankly, the IPCC's legal officer caught a sight of that agreement and it probably expressed the view that it's not worth the paper that it's written on, which I should say is the only reason I signed it in the first place, I might add. But I think we are going to need to look at it. That agreement was signed, at the time it was signed, there was only one body that had a formal legal personality, and that was EASA. So we are going to have to come and look at that again, I think. That's probably quite enough to throw into the hat there, Detlef, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jim, for those insights, both in terms of how we relate to the ongoing work in university as well as the IPCC needs for further information and how that relates. And that means that we will now move to the final speaker, who is Thomas Spencer. Originally, Laura Gozzi was going to join us, but she had a last-minute problem, and Thomas Spencer, being the power sector modeler of IEA, was welcome to step in. So thank you very much for that, Thomas.
Thanks a lot, Detlef. Yeah, so I'll jump straight in view of the time. This slide is very similar to the one that Alan presented, so I'm not going to talk through it in great detail. But I think it's interesting to note that a lot of research teams are finding similar things, that compared to pre-Paris baselines, we are starting to bend the curve. I just want to make two points with this slide. The first one is that we need to pay attention to the issue of policy consistency of these announced pledges. So if you look at the gap between our stated policy scenario at the IEA and the announced pledges or updated announced pledges scenario in 2050, more than 50% of the gap between stated policies and net zero emissions, we don't yet see the policies on the table to achieve those reductions, although they are baked into the pledges. And obviously 2050 is a long time forward, but we're dealing with a slow moving system and we need to start seeing these policies in place. And I think paying attention to what we called in this year's World Energy Outlook, the implementation gap, is a role that the IAM community can play. Second point is the issue of time consistency. We really see a backloading of pledges. If you look at how much of the gap between the stated policy scenario and the net zero emissions scenario we close in 2030, we only close about 20% of it with the pledges that are on the table for Glasgow, a little less than 30% of it with the pledges that were on the table after Glasgow. And this means that if we follow these pledges, we face a really heavy lift after 2030. And so thinking carefully about the risks of lock-in stranded assets and feasible speeds of transition, given this kind of backloaded trajectory, I think is a really important research. Second slide, we've used an investment figure to illustrate it here, but we could use a number of others. This one shows the amount of clean energy investment that we have historically and in the period 2026 to 2030 in the announced pledges case and the net zero emissions scenario. The key insight for us here is that between the announced pledges scenario in 2030 and the net zero emissions scenario, 70% of the increase in clean energy investment needs to come in emerging market and developing economies. And this for us is a critical aspect of transition to zero emissions. How do we raise the needed investments? Jim rightly mentioned the capital is there, but the question of how to direct it towards emerging market and developing economies is really critical. And I think this is becoming a growing concern politically. You're seeing, I think, how shall I put it, increasing success in the agenda of starting to ramp down fossil fuel financing without a commensurate increase in the agenda of increasing the availability of capital for clean energy investment. And so a lot of emerging market and developing economies came out of Glasgow with concerns around the language around phasing down unabated coal and so on, and without the success on the issue of scaling up investment for clean energy technologies. And we highlighted in this year's WEO that current levels of upstream investment in oil and gas are actually consistent with the net zero emissions scenario. It's on the scale up of investment in clean energy technologies that we are falling far short. And this raises concern for the stability and of energy markets going forward, as well as the feasibility of the transition. So a laser focus on emerging market and developing economies and the investment agenda, I think, is something this community could contribute to as well. Last slide, a little bit on uncertainties when we think about modeling the energy transition to net zero. These, I won't go through them all, are some of the key ones that we see. Operating a large-scale global energy systems model. And this addressing these uncertainties, I think, is also something that would be of interest from the IM community. I want to say that if you look at the net zero emissions report that we produced in May, we did an analysis of how the NZE scenario there compares with comparable scenarios in the AR 1.5 database. We saw a number of key differences. When we come back and look at the sort of newer generation of integrated assessment scenarios, I think at the primary energy level, we're starting to see much more convergence in the nature of those scenarios, and also in the electricity generation mix. It's more on the end use and demand side where we still see quite substantial divergences, on the one hand, within IPCC or integrated assessment scenarios, but also between our own scenarios and integrated assessment scenarios. And for us, this suggests a real need to dive deeper into the end use transitions, because it seems to me that we're starting to see convergence at the primary energy level of the nature of a net zero emissions system, but still a fair bit of divergence and uncertainty about those end use transitions. Final point that I want to make here is we need to start thinking about the implications of a bottom-up governance regime like Paris and Glasgow have left us with, and increasing ambitions. And let me put it this way. It didn't really matter that we had a bottom-up governance regime when ambitions were low, right? Now that ambitions are increasing, we start to see potentially more and more tensions between an accelerating transition and our ability to govern that transition. This relates, for example, to distributional concerns between and within countries. It relates to policy domains that are not strictly speaking in the field of climate change, whether it be trade, innovation, finance, and so on. So investigating this issue of what does transition look like in a world of converging ambitions but fragmented policies is, I think, a critical agenda going forward. And I think traditionally the way the integrated assessment community has thought about fragmented policy scenarios is no longer appropriate. That was for a sort of pre-Copenhagen, pre-Paris world where we were thinking about the timeline when countries would accede to a global regime and what would happen if that timeline was different. All countries have acceded now to the global regime, but that global regime is very bottom-up. So what does it mean for our ability to govern the transition? I think integrated assessment models are very well placed to explore these potential frictions and interactions between sectors and policy domains. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Thomas. Those were very helpful insights related to modeling of planned policies, the lock-in, the importance of that, the feasibility of the transition, the importance also of uncertainties, especially in the end-use side, and governance issues. As I indicated, I can open up the floor for questions. Volker, do you want to come in and say a little bit about the discussion you had in the chat on the challenge for us to speed up, as Niklas was calling us to do?
Yeah, happy to do so. I think the point that Niklas made is actually an excellent one, and I was involved in the NDC current policy assessment in the upcoming AR6, and that was a bit, it was challenging, and we actually were in the end forced, in particular for the very policy relevant pathways or assessments that took post-COVID and updated NDCs up until basically the literature cutoff date. We were forced to essentially go with non-peer-reviewed literature. It was a question of peer review or relevant. So this is, I think Niklas is making a very good point here, and in terms of responding to this, I don't think we want to give up scientific peer review, which is a well-established and important process. But as the COVID crisis has basically taught us, that there seems to be a hybrid model that on the one hand responds to the urgency, where you put basically immediately once the publication is out onto a preprint server, or you go with a journal that actually goes for a public type of review process where paper is again immediately publicly accessible, and there's an ongoing parallel peer review process going on before it gets the ultimate approval stamp. Obviously, there is an editor or someone has to take the first step in saying that, okay, this passes the LAF test and is worthwhile entering that review process. But I think speeding, I mean, in light of the upcoming challenges that Niklas and all other speakers basically highlighted, I think this is a role model that we as a community may want to more accelerate, actually, that this type of publishing becomes the standard as opposed to being at the moment still a relatively minor outlier thing.
Thanks, Volker. Jim.
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to remind that IPCC is not constrained just to look at peer-reviewed literature. When it produces its assessments, though obviously it needs to make some judgment about the quality of the material that goes in. I think the challenge here is also in terms of looking at the landing zones among, in the UNFCCC process, for example, where governments place a great value on IPCC outputs because IPCC is government owned, and they actually place higher credibility, whether it's justified or not, on the IPCC outputs. So I think the critical thing is, IPCC, I think, can test the water a bit at the edges with what it takes into account. The requirement is if the inputs are non-published, they have to be available for reviewers to take a look at. If you can pass that test, I think IPCC should, as it were, push the limit a bit.
Thanks, Niklas and Ellen. But please be relatively brief so that we can still allow for others to speak in.
Yeah, just quickly, I definitely think that we should keep the scientific peer review process. That's clear, and I think the proposals that came here to have preprints is the right way of doing it. And somebody, Alexander, mentioned in the chat that there are already preprints for some journals, and that's a quite good way forward. I really like that.
Alan?
And I just add, the published literature is only one way for the IM community to influence policymakers. A lot of models, work directly with policymakers and doing analytical support, through developing long-term strategies or, just close-in analytical support for negotiations or, developing, national policies. And sometimes you can do that work in parallel with developing the peer-reviewed literature. So the two papers that I showed in my presentation, both of those grew out of analytical support for U.S. State Department ahead of Paris and ahead of Glasgow. And we were able to also then feed that work into the peer-reviewed literature. So it wasn't just informing our government audience, but also informing the broader community.
Great, thanks. I'm going to ask David and Elmar to quickly ask their questions and then see whether we can have responses to that. First, David McCollum.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Detlef. Yeah, thanks everyone. Actually, Alan was exactly hitting on this point that I had just posed, the question I had posed in the chat, which in a nutshell just asked, since the Paris Agreement, the number of these organizations that have kind of play in this middle space between the scientific community and the the action community, the policy community, I mean, it's just increased by an order of magnitude, right? And which is great. And so I was wondering, from the perspective of where folks like Alan and Niklas sit, how they see that process has evolved, how it will continue to evolve. What's the best way for those of us on the who are spending most of our time on the scientific side, how to kind of inject the science into the knowledge pipeline. And there are, Alan hit on a few different ways to do this, but I think organizations like Climate Analytics, Climate Action Tracker have also done a fabulous job. I think it's also, personally, I see it's a function of personnel as well. I mean, you see people coming from the scientific community getting hired by some of these organizations, some of these more think tanky NGO organizations, and then have this embedded institutional knowledge with them, also have the networks in the community, and then can also kind of know that other side and are able to play both sides. I mean, yeah. So anyway, it was a question for the others to see where they think this is going and how we can do our best to get that work in there, how to partner and to do other things other than papers, writing op-ed pieces and so on and so on. So anyway, it was a general thought.
Thanks. Elmar, quickly.
Thanks a lot to the four panelists. Extremely interesting and useful. I have wanted to pick up on something what you said, Alan, and I don't want to put wrong words in your mouth, so please push back if I do. And that's the topic of carbon pricing or economic or pricing policies versus regulatory policies or subsidies policies, and also then coupled to this the notion that governments might be leading from behind. It's really the technology development and the industry driving this. I really believe that we would be making a mistake I mean, we have this debate since a long time. I don't think the timescales of going net zero would fit that. And this is not about the convenience of modeling, which is definitely given, that's a given, but it's about the impact of these policy instruments. And if we don't have a carbon price, we will not be able to phase out these carbon intensive activities in a way that would be needed as fast as comprehensive. And therefore this leadership of governments and these pricing policies will be needed, maybe even for the innovation part, because what we see in the literature is that patents and so on increase if fossil fuel becomes more expensive. So I really want to warn because having this modeling argument to jump to the conclusion that let's no longer do that. And finding from our model is, at least, we do all these differentiate policies and we do the regulated policies, but as soon as we remove a carbon price completely, we are not getting anywhere near net zero. And maybe that's different for other models, but that's our finding. Thanks.
Thanks, Elmar. So let's do a final round across the panelists and see whether people would like to respond to the remarks by Elmar and David. Alan first.
So thanks, Elmar, and I totally agree that you really need a carbon price in there to get at the totality of what needs to happen. But I think there are two fundamental market failures we're trying to address: the non-priced emissions, but also the R&D market failure. And in a modeling world, we don't do nearly as good of a job in the R&D market failure. And I think Niklas had a very nice way of putting it out. There's a ton of actual policy support going into those early phases of R&D that are making that technology suite possible. So we think about going out towards getting out that last 10%, the challenge of getting all the way to net zero. Yes, a carbon price will get up to all of those nooks and crannies of the economy and help drive it. But we also need the early on technology support to make sure those technologies are there. So they're very much complementary. And then the only other aspect of this is something we've heard from David Victor early on. There's just a lot more difficulties in making that carbon price a reality, from a political economy perspective. So, as an economist talking to, policymakers, I've, been advocating on carbon prices, for many, many years. But, I think it's worth for us to acknowledge that, it's not that they're not, listening or don't know that, a carbon price is an incredibly effective instrument. But there are real challenges they're facing, outside of just the economics of it, of how difficult it is to adopt a carbon price and adopt it at the right level. And if we do all of the work on the technology side to make things easier and the technology costs come down, that actually makes the eventually putting the price-based policy or that carbon price policy or all those other policies in place a lot easier. So representing those earlier enabling policies is important. I think that's a difficult thing to do in the models.
Thanks, Alan. Niklas, anything?
Yeah, definitely. Following up on the carbon price discussion, definitely. I think I heard nobody just saying we should drop it completely. That's not the issue. I think it's the mix, and we need many different things. And my point was that you need, in addition, definitely something to initiate at the very beginning of the transition, to initiate these technologies that we have no idea of yet, that still need to be developed, and that we need to go to zero. And that was also the point. There was a question in the chat how to put these early signs of transformation into the integrated assessment models. If we have this exponential curve, then knowing where you are on the exponential curve is very, very important, because if you're a bit later, it's much, much later. If you're a bit earlier, it's much, much earlier. No, because it's, well, exponential change. And so the more you know where you are right now, the more you can predict into the future. And for this exponential change, it's even more relevant that you know it exactly. And that's what I'm saying. So if you know that zero emission steel is already a little bit further advanced, then you can take that as an assumption into your integrated assessment model and then do it. And the last question from David on the science policy interface. Yeah, I'm a bit biased, running the climate action tracker, which is indeed in between science and policy and done to be quick and to provide these insights quickly. I think, well, that's why I'm there. I think that's the model to go, but you need everything. You need the integrated assessment model as the very thorough, slow peer review process. And you need a bit of a fast track thing, and only both together really do the job.
Thanks, Niklas. Jim.
Yeah, sure. Nobody can resist talking about carbon pricing, with which I think I've debated Elmar before. So just to say, I mean, a carbon price is absolutely essential in areas like energy, industry, and nobody's going to put CO2 into geological storage unless they're paid to do it. The question is really, are there other parts of the economy where you've got millions upon millions of consumers or farmers who need shifted? And there are advantages from straight regulation because it gets around transaction costs, it gets around information acquisition costs. And it may indeed be the case that it takes time for carbon prices to work through, which is quite difficult given the urgency with which we're dealing with things at the moment. So, it's going to be a blend. At the end of the day, and agree with everything Alan said as well.
Thanks, Jim. Thomas, do you want to respond as well?
Yep. I don't want to actually respond on any question. I want to make one more very quick point, which, because I was rushing a little bit, I didn't make, which is that I think in this world of, we're no longer asking where we need to go. We're asking how to get there. It means that there is a slightly different role for scenarios. And while I continue to believe that there's a critical importance of scenario ensembles and multi-scenario studies, I actually think there's a lot of value in just really dissecting one scenario from one model and understanding its drivers. I think we don't often enough give policymakers an extremely detailed view of what the transition looks like. And we try to do that with our net zero report. And from the IAM community, that's a kind of strange document because it's based on one scenario, right? But we just went in as much detail as we possibly could. And I think that approach is useful also to policymakers now that they are increasingly asking themselves, how do we get there? Not just where do we need to go? But fascinating discussion. Thanks very much. I was really enjoyed being part of it.
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, so this was really an important session, I think, in the conference. Somehow we again give it too little time because we could have continued this session for quite a while. I really would like to thank the 4 panelists for their insights and their inspirational thoughts, because I think they can help us to further find policy relevant research. And so a round of applause, a round of virtual applause, and for 4 excellent speakers.